Will you walk into my parlour? Said the spider to the fly. 'Tis the prettiest little parlour that ever you did spy. The way into my parlour is up a winding stair, and I have many pretty things to show when you are there. Oh, no, 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 said the little fly. To ask me is in vain, for who goes up your winding stair can ne'er come down again. I'm sure you must be weary, dear, with soaring up so high. Will you rest upon my little bed? Said the spider to the fly. There are pretty curtains drawn around, the sheets are fine and thin. And if you like to rest a while, I'll snugly tuck you in. Oh, no, no, said the little fly, for I've often heard it said, they never, never wake again who sleep upon your bed. Said the cunning spider to the fly, dear friend, what shall I do to prove the warm affection I've always felt for you? I have within my pantry good store of all that's nice. I'm sure you're very welcome. Will you please to take a slice? Oh, no, no, said the little fly. Kind sir, that cannot be. I've heard what's in your pantry, and I do not wish to see. Sweet creature, said the spider, you're witty and you're wise. How handsome are your gauzy wings. How brilliant your eyes. I have a little looking glass upon my parlour shelf. If you'll step in one moment, dear, you shall behold yourself. I thank you, gentle sir, she said, for what you're pleased to say, and bidding you good morning now, I'll call another day. The spider turned him round about and went into his den, for well he knew the silly fly would soon be back again. So he wove a subtle web in a little corner sly, and set his table ready to dine upon the fly. Then he came to his door again, and merrily did sing, Come hither, hither, pretty fly, with the pearl and silver wing. Your robes are green and purple, there's a crest upon your head. Your eyes are like the diamond bright, but mine are dull as lead. Alas, alas, how very soon this silly little fly, hearing his wily flattering words, came slowly flitting by. With buzzing wings she hung aloft, then nearer and nearer drew, thinking only of her brilliant eyes and green and purple hue, thinking only of her crested head. Poor foolish thing. At last up jumped the cunning spider, and fiercely held her fast. He dragged her up his winding stair into his dismal den within his little parlour. But she ne'er came out again. And now, dear little children, who may this story read, to idle, silly, flattering words, I pray you ne'er will heed. Unto an evil counsellor, close heart and ear and eye, and take a lesson from this tale of the spider and the fly. A few more people to this Halloween readings. It's time again to wish you all a horrific Halloween. To thank you warmly for making this 7th annual a spectacular sellout. Sardines in a can ain't got nothing on you folks. So shed those Anglo-Saxon inhibitions and cozy up to your nerves. You know, the word popular would have no meaning without the word people. And so, for the ongoing popularity of this yearly event. I am, dear people, most obliged to you. Having been sorely smitten with election fever this year, I simply could not resist sharing the contents of a card I just received from a friend in San Francisco. On the front of it was a stern and pointing George Bush saying, "It's Halloween, and I, George Herbert Walker Bush, am the President of the United States." And on the inside it said, "Now that's frightening." I offer that with apologies to the remaining Bush devotees. Though these artists are all the same. On a more serious note, with November the 3rd still very much in mind, as an advocate for the natural world these past 17 years, a voice for the voiceless, you might say, my conscience dictates to you, captive audience, that I tell you a true tale of terror. Our wild friends, those creatures, great and small, out there in my beloved Sonoran Desert, are still being legally caught in those medieval devices for steel jaw leg-hold traps. A resounding yes, Proposition 200, would finally put an end to our wildlife's suffering and close the book forever on bear tail terror. So we'll do the kind thing on Tuesday, shall we? That clapping translates into a vote or two. Thank you. Happy to relate, this month I've got a lot to celebrate. This great Halloween crowd, for instance, and not the least, the 30th anniversary of my sojourn in this soul home of mine, the great and splendorous Sonoran Desert. With these thoughts of celebration and gratitude uppermost, I should like to invite the night owls, and indeed the owlish bookworms among you, to come join me and my friends at Pool Books, who have kindly put on a reception afterwards at their Borgata store, just 2 minutes away on foot. Not bad for conservation, on foot. So do stroll over, run an hour or so. You know, I don't often get enough of a chance to visit with you good folks after the Halloween performances, but tonight I will have one, thanks to the gal and guy ghouls at Pools. What other language could you do that in? What I consider an old favorite, one of the most barbarously vivid tales in all of English literature. It's The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar, and it sealed the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. Scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, with a pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress and termination of the disease were the incidents of but half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong, lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and great hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means of neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell you of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but a little more than one at one time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. The windows were of a stained glass whose colour varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestry, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. Seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the wall, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the colour of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood colour. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was any lamp or candelabrum, amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to or fro or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illumined the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearance. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical. But of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of the hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound. And thus the waltzes perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company, and while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows, as if in confused reverie or meditation. When the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that the next timing of the clock should not produce in them any similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came another chiming of the clock, and then with the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colours, effects. He disregarded the decor of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric lustre. There are some who would have thought him mad. Scholars felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not mad. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the seven chambers upon occasion of this great fete, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as a madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the seven chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these dreams writhed in and about, taking hue from the room and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon, there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet, and then for a moment all is still and all is silent save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand. But the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the seven, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-coloured panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls, and to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. These other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. And the revel went whirlingly on until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock, and then the music ceased as I have told, and the evolution of the waltzes were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled. And thus too it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which has arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumour of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the company a buzz, a murmur expressive of disapprobation and surprise, then finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of even the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests, there are matters in which no jest can be made. The whole company indeed seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to represent the countenance of a stiffened corpse that it was made that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheek. And yet all this might have been endured if not approved by the mad revellers around. But the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. And the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzes. He was seen to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened into rage. "Who dares?" he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him. "Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang through the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now, with deliberate and stately step, made a closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that unimpeded he passed within a yard of the prince's person, while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centres of the room to the walls. He made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers while none followed him, on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revellers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask which they handled with so violent a rudeness untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revellers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the light of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. Sounds like a Republican press release on Bill Clinton's State of the Union. Well, that's the way to do it. I thought it was very nice to lighten up. I tend to try and lighten up a little bit. And if we had everyone was like that, you'd be reeling out of here. But I resisted. I want to see you reel out of here. The funny one comes after this one. This is by my old and ancient favorite, H.H. Munro, Saki, that I came upon late in life as a writer. An Englishman died in the First World War in 1917. Last words were supposed to be, "Put that bloody cigarette out." Anyway, he left us with a wonderful legacy of extremely sardonic, brilliantly satiric, and extremely well-written British humour stories. The Wolves of Senecrats. Are there any old legends attached to the castle? Asked Conrad of his sister. Conrad was a prosperous Hamburg merchant, but he was the one poetically dispositioned member of an eminently practical family. The Baroness Greubel shrugged her plump shoulders. There are always legends hanging about these old places. They're not difficult to invent, they cost nothing. In this case, there's a story that when anyone dies in the castle, all the dogs in the village and the wild beasts in the forest howl the night long. It would not be pleasant to listen to, would it? It would be weird and romantic, said the poetic disposition of Hamburg. Anyway, it isn't true, said the Baroness complacently. Since we bought the place, we have proof that nothing of this sort happens. When the old mother-in-law died last springtime, we all listened, but there was no howling. It's just a story that lends dignity to the place without costing anything. The story is not as you have told it, said Amelie, the grey old governess. Everyone turned and looked at her in astonishment. She was wont to sit silent and prim and faded in her place at table, never speaking unless someone spoke to her, and there were few who troubled themselves to make conversation with her. Today, a sudden volubility had descended on her. She continued to talk rapidly and nervously, looking straight in front of her and seeming to address no one in particular. It is not when anyone dies in the castle that the howling is heard. It was when one of the Somerset's family died here that the wolves came from far and near and howled at the edge of the forest just before the death hour. There were only a few couple of wolves that had their lairs in this part of the forest. But at such a time, the keeper said, there would be scores of them, gliding about in the shadows and howling in chorus, and the dogs of the castle and the village and all the farms around would bay and howl in fear and anger at the wolf chorus. And as the soul of the dying one left its body, a tree would crash down in the park. That is what happened when a Cernogratz died in his family castle. But for a stranger dying here, of course, no wolf would howl and no tree would fall. Oh no. There was a note of defiance, almost of contempt, in her voice as she said the last words. The well-fed, much too well-dressed Baroness stared angrily at the dowdy old woman who had come forth from her usual and seemly position of effacement to speak so disrespectfully. You seem to know quite a lot about the Cernogratz legend of Fraulein Schmidt, he said sharply. I did not know that the family histories were among the subjects you are supposed to be proficient in. The answer to her taunt was even more unexpected and astonishing than the conversational outbreak which had provoked it. I am a von Cernogratz myself, said the old woman. That is why I know the family history. You? A von Cernogratz? Came an incredulous chorus. When we became very poor, she explained, and I had to go out and give teaching lessons, I took another name. I thought it would be more in keeping, but my grandfather spent much of his time as a boy in this castle, and my father used to tell me many stories about it, and of course, I knew all the family legends and stories. When one has nothing left to one but memories, one guards and dusts them with especial care. I little thought when I took service with you that I should one day come with you to the old home of my family. I could wish it had been anywhere else. There was a silence when she finished speaking, and then the Baroness turned the conversation to a less embarrassing topic than family histories. But afterwards, when the old governess had slipped away quietly to her duties, there arose a clamour of derision and disbelief. It was an impertinence, snapped out the Baron, his protruding eyes taking on a scandalized expression. Sorry, Fancy the woman talking like that at our table. She almost told us we were nobodies, and I don't believe I've heard of it. She's just a Schmidt and nothing more. Dispatched from the Schmidt house. She had been talking to some of the peasants about the old Cernogratz family and raked up their history and their stories. That's all. She wants to make herself out some sort of consequence, said the Baroness. She knows she will soon be past work, and she wants to appeal to our sympathies. But grandfather, indeed. Baroness had the usual number of grandfathers, but she never boasted about it. I dare say our grandfather was a pantry boy or something of the sort in the castle, sniggered the Baron. That part of the story may be true. The merchant from Hamburg said nothing. He had seen tears in the old woman's eyes when she spoke of guarding her memories. Or being of an imaginative disposition, he thought he had. I shall give her notice to go as soon as the New Year festivities are over, said the Baroness. Till then, I shall be too busy to manage without her. But she had to manage without her all the same. For in the cold, biting weather after Christmas, the old governess fell ill and kept to her room. It is most provoking, said the Baroness, as her guests sat around the fire on one of the last evenings of the dying year. All the time that she's been with us, I cannot remember that she was ever seriously ill, too ill to go about and do her work, I mean. And now when I have the house full and she could be useful in so many ways, she goes and breaks down. No one is sorry for her, of course, but she looks so withered and shrunken, but it's intensely annoying all the same. Most annoying, said the banker's wife sympathetically, is the intense cold, I suspect. It breaks the old people up. It's been unusually cold this year. The frost is the sharpest that has been known in December for many years, said the Baron. And of course she's quite old, said the Baroness. I wish I'd given her notice some weeks ago, then she would have left before this happened to her. Why, Whoppy, what is the matter with you? The small woolly lapdog had leapt suddenly down from its cushion and crept shivering under the sofa. Same moment, an outburst of angry barking came from the dogs in the castle yard, and other dogs could be heard yapping and barking in the distance. What is disturbing the animals? Said the Baron. And then the humans, listening intently, heard the sound that had roused the dogs to their demonstrations of fear and rage. Heard a long-drawn, whining howl, rising and falling, seeming at one moment leagues away, at others sweeping across the snow till it appeared to come from the foot of the castle walls. All the starved, cold misery of a frozen world, all the relentless hunger fury of the wild, blended with other forlorn and haunting melodies to which one could give no name, seemed concentrated in that wailing cry. Wolves! Cried the Baron. Their music broke forth in one raging burst, seeming to come from everywhere. Hundreds of wolves, said the Hamburg merchant, who was a man of strong imagination. Moved by some impulse which he could not have explained, the Baroness left her guests and made her way to the narrow, cheerless room where the old governess lay watching the hours of the dying years slip by. In spite of the biting cold of the winter night, the window stood open. With a scandalized exclamation on her lips, the Baroness rushed forward to close it. "Leave it open!" said the old woman in a voice that, for all its weakness, carried an air of command, such as the Baroness had never before heard on her lips. "But you'll die of cold," she expostulated. "I am dying in any case," said the voice, "and I want to hear their music. They have come from far and wide to sing the death music of my family. It is beautiful when they come. I am the last born Cenographs that will die in our old castle, and they have come to sing to me. Hark, how loud they are calling." The cry of the wolves rose on the still winter air and floated around the castle walls in long-drawn, piercing wails. The old woman lay back on her couch with a look of long-delayed happiness on her face. "Go away," she said to the Baroness. "I am not lonely anymore. I am one of a great old family." "I think she's dying," said the Baroness. "I suppose we must send for a doctor. That terrible howling! Not for much money would I have such death music." "That music is not to be bought for any amount of money," said Conrad. "Hark! What is the other sound?" asked the Baron, as the noise of splitting and crashing was heard. It was a tree falling apart. There was a moment of constrained silence, and then the banker's wife spoke. "It is the intense cold that's splitting the trees. It's also the cold that has brought the wolves out in such numbers. It's many years since we have had such a cold winter." The Baroness eagerly agreed that the cold was responsible for these things. It was the cold of the open window, too, which caused the heart failure that made the doctor's ministrations unnecessary for the old Fraulein. But the obituary notice in the newspapers looked very well. On December 29th at Schloss Cenographs, Amalie von Cenographs, for many years the valued friend of Baron and Baroness. Something more treacherous than people, right? On a positive note, instead of negatively, I want to read you something, talking of wolves, apropos Lobo. pick this up. Tucson, an area northeast of Safford, has been chosen as the best site in Arizona for reintroducing the endangered Mexican wolves to the wild. Viva el lobo. Apparently, H.H. Munro grew up under a very heavy feminine domination. I think he had, dreadful aunts. And it so stayed with him, poor man, that even his work as an adult always was, there are many stories reflecting, sort of Baroness Freud's overpowering aunts. And he tried to exercise these experiences through his writing. This is a favorite. I have read this one before, but I don't think I try not to repeat the immediate last year. This is a very favorite one of mine by Saki. The Open Window. My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Nuttall, said a very self-possessed young lady of 15. In the meantime, you must try and put up with me. Frampton Nuttall endeavoured to say the correct something which should duly flatter the niece of the moment without unduly discounting the aunt that was to come. Privately, he doubted more than ever whether these formal visits on a succession of total strangers would do much towards helping the nerve cure which he was supposed to be undergoing. I know how it will be, his sister had said when he was preparing to migrate to this rural retreat. You will bury yourself down there, not speak to a living soul, and your nerves will be worse than ever from moping. I shall just give you letters of introduction to all the people I know there. Some of them, as far as I can remember, were quite nice. Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Sappleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice category. Do you know many of the people round here? Asked the niece when she judged that they had had sufficient silent communion. You are hardly a soul, said Frampton. My sister was staying here at the rectory, some 4 years ago, and she gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here. She made the last statement in a tone of distinct regret. Then you know practically nothing about my aunt, pursued the self-possessed young lady. Only her name and address, admitted the caller. He was wondering whether Mrs. Sappleton was in the married or widowed state. An undefinable something about the room seemed to suggest masculine habitation. A great tragedy happened about 3 years ago, said the child. That would be since your sister's time. A tragedy? Asked Frampton. Somehow in this restful country spot, tragedy seemed out of place. You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon, said the niece, indicating a large French window that opened out on the lawn. But it is quite warm at the time of year, said Frampton, but has that window got anything to do with the tragedy? Out through that window, 3 years ago to a day, her husband and her 2 young brothers went off for their day's shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favourite snipe shooting ground, they were all 3 engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, and places that were saved in other years gave way suddenly without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it. Here the child's voice lost its self-possessed tone and became falteringly human. Poor aunt always thinks that they will come back someday, bury the little brown spaniel that was lost with them, and walk in at that window just as they used to do. That's why the window is kept open every evening till it is quite dusk. Poor dear aunt, she's often told me how they went out, her husband with his white waterproof coat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing, "Bertie, why do you bound?" as he always did to tease her because she said it got on her nerves. Sometimes on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get a creepy feeling that they were all walking through the town. She broke off with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late and making her appearance. I hope Vera has been amusing you. She's been very interesting, said Frampton. Oh, I hope you don't mind the open window, Mr. Nuttall, said Mrs. Stapleton briskly. My husband and brothers will be home directly from shooting, and they always come in this way. They've been out for snipe in the marshes today, so they'll make a fine mess over my pork carpets, just like you men folk, isn't it? She rattled on cheerfully about the shooting, the scarcity of birds, and the prospect of duck in the winter. To Frampton, it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate but only partially successful effort to turn the talk onto a less ghastly topic. He was conscious that his hostess was giving him only a fragment of her attention, and that her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window and the lawn beyond. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visit on this tragic anniversary. The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest, an absence of mental excitement, and avoidance of anything in the nature of violent physical exercise, announced Frampton, who laboured under the widespread delusion that total strangers and chance acquaintances are hungry for the least details of one's ailments. They're caused and they're cured. On the matter of diet, they're not much in agreement, he said. No, said Mrs. Stapleton, in a voice which only replaced a yawn at the last minute. Then suddenly she brightened into alert attention, but not to what Frampton was saying. There they are at last, she cried, just in time for tea. And don't they look as if they were muddy up to the eyes? She shivered slightly and turned towards the niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic comprehension. The child was staring out through the open window with dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill shock of nameless fear, Frampton swung round in his seat and looked in the same direction. In the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn towards the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them was additionally burdened with a white coat hung over his shoulders. A tired brown spaniel kept close at their heels. Noiselessly they neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk, I say, Bertie, why are you bound? Frampton had wildly his stick and hat. The hall door, the gravel drive, and the front gate were dimly noted stages in his headlong. The cyclist coming down the road had to run into a hedge to avoid imminent collision. Here we are, my dear, said the bearer of the white mackintosh, coming into the window. Fairly muddy, most of it's dry. Who was that who bolted out as we came up? A most extraordinary man, Mr. Nuttall, said Mrs. Stapleton, could only talk about his illnesses, and dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think you'd seen a ghost. I expect it was the spaniel, said Louise. He told me he had a horror of dogs. He was once hunted into a cemetery somewhere on the banks of the Ganges by a pack of pariah dogs and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave. The creature snarling and grinning and foaming just above him. It was enough to make anyone lose their nerve. Tall tales at short notice were the niece's specialty. least the location of it, is particularly significant to me because I come from the Yorkshire Moors, I love the Yorkshire Moors, and I've even been lost on the Yorkshire Moors. Let's go back. I didn't have the same experiences as this man had, but anyway. At the moorland crossroads, Martin stood examining the signpost for several minutes in some bewilderment. The names on the four arms were not what he expected. Distances were not given, and his map, he concluded with impatience, must be hopelessly out of date. Spreading it against the post, he stooped to study it more closely. The wind blew the corners flapping against his face. The small print was almost indecipherable in the fading light. It appeared, however, as well as he could make out, that 2 miles back, he must have taken the wrong turning. He remembered that turning. The path that looked inviting. He had hesitated a moment, then followed it, caught by the usual lure of walkers that it might prove a shortcut. The shortcut snare is as old as human nature. For some minutes he studied the signpost and the map alternatively. Dusk was falling and his knapsack had grown heavy. He could not make the two guides tally, however, and a feeling of uncertainty crept over his mind. He felt oddly baffled, frustrated. His thought grew thick. Decision was most difficult. I'm muddled, he thought. Must be tired, as at length he chose the most likely arm. Sooner or later it would bring me to an inn, though not the one I intended. He accepted his walker's luck and started briskly. The arm read, "Over Literacy Hill," in small, fine letters that danced and shifted every time he looked at them, but the name was not discoverable on the map. It was, however, inviting, like a shortcut. Similar impulse again directed his choice, only this time it seemed more insistent, almost urgent. And he became aware then of the exceeding loneliness of the country around him. The road for 100 yards went straight, then curved like a white river running into space. The deep blue-green of heather lining the banks, spreading upwards through the twilight, and occasional small pines stood solitary here and there, all unexplained. The curious adjective, unexplained, having made its appearance, haunted him. So many things that afternoon were similarly unexplained. Shortcut, the darkened map, the names on the signpost, his own erratic impulses, and the growing strange confusion that crept upon his spirit. The entire countryside needed explanation, though perhaps interpretation was a truer word. Those little lonely trees that made him see it. Why had he lost his way so easily? Why did he suffer vague impressions to influence his direction? Why was he here, exactly here? And why did he now go over Literacy Hill? Then, by a green field that shone like a thought of daylight amid the darkness of the moor, he saw a figure lying in the grass. It was a blot upon the landscape, a mere huddled patch of dirty rags, yet with a certain horrid picturesqueness too. And his mind, though his German was of the schoolroom order, at once picked out the German equivalents as against English. Lump and lumpen flashed across his brain most oddly. They seemed in that moment right and so expressive, almost like onomatopoeic words, if that were possible of sight. Neither rags nor rascal would have fitted what he saw. The adequate description was in German. Here was a clue tossed up by a part of him that did not reason, but it seems he missed it. And the next moment the tramp rose to a sitting posture and asked the time of evening. In German he asked it, and Martin, answering without a second's hesitation, gave it also in German, 6:30, 6:30. The instinctive guess was accurate. A glance at his watch when he looked a moment later proved it. He heard the man say with the covert insolence of tramps, "Thank you, much obliged." But Martin had not shown his watch. Another intuition subconsciously obeyed. He quickened his pace along that lonely road, a curious jumble of thoughts and feelings surging through him. He had somehow known the question would come in German, yet it flustered and dismayed him. Another thing had also flustered and dismayed him. He had expected it in the same queer fashion. It was right. For when the ragged brown thing rose to ask a question, a part of it remained lying on the grass, another brown, dirty thing. There were two tramps, and he saw both faces clearly. Behind the untidy beards, below the slouch hats, he caught the look of unpleasant, clever faces that watched him closely while he passed. The eyes followed him. For a second he looked straight into those eyes so that he could not fail to know them, and he understood quite horridly that both faces were too sleek, refined, and cunning for those of ordinary tramps. The men were not really tramps at all. They were disguised. How covertly they watched me, was his thought as he hurried along the darkening road, in dead earnestness now, aware of the loneliness and desolation of the moorland all about him. Uneasy and distressed, he increased his pace. Midway in thinking what an unnecessarily clanking noise his nailed boots made upon the hard white road, there came upon him, with a rush together, the company of these things that haunted him as unexplained. They brought a single definite message: that all this business was not really meant for him at all. And hence his confusion and bewilderment. That he had intruded into someone else's scenery and was trespassing upon another's map of life. By some wrong inner turning, he had interpolated his person into a group of foreign forces which operated in the little world of someone else. Unwittingly somewhere he had crossed the threshold and now was fairly in, a trespasser, an eavesdropper, a peeping Tom. He was listening, peeping, overhearing things that he had no right to know because they were intended for another. Like a ship at sea, he was intercepting wireless messages he could not properly interpret because his receiver was not accurately tuned to their reception. And more, these messages were warnings. Then fear dropped upon him like the night. He was caught in a net of delicate, deep forces that he could not manage, knowing neither their origin nor purpose. He had walked into some huge psychic trap, elaborately planned and baited, yet calculated for another than himself. Something had lured him in, something in the landscape, the time of day, his mood, owing to some undiscovered weakness in himself. He had been easily caught. His fear slipped easily into terror. What happened next happened with such speed and concentration that it all seemed crammed into a moment. At once and in a heap it happened. It was quite inevitable. Down the road to meet him, a man came swaying from side to side, in drunkenness, quite obviously feigned. Tramp. And while Martin made room for him to pass, the lurch changed in a second to attack, and the fellow was upon him. The blow was sudden and terrific, yet even while it fell, Martin was aware that from behind him rushed a second man who caught his legs from under him and bore him with a thud and crash to the ground. Blows rained then. He saw a gleam of something shining. A sudden deadly nausea plunged into him into utter weakness where no resistance was possible. Something of fire entered his throat, and from his mouth poured a thick, sweet thing that choked him. The world sank far away into darkness. Yet through all the horror and confusion ran the trail of two clear thoughts. He realized that the first tramp had sneaked at a fast double through the heather and so come to meet him, and that something heavy was torn from the fastenings that clipped it tight and close beneath his clothes against his body. Abruptly then, the darkness lifted, passed utterly away. He found himself peering into a map against the signpost. The wind was flapping the corners against his cheek, and he was poring over the names that now he saw quite clear. Upon the arms of the signpost above were those he had expected to find, and the map recorded them quite faithfully. All was accurate again, and as it should be. He read the name of the village he had meant to make. It was plainly visible in the dusk, 2 miles the distance given. Bewildered, shaken, unable to think of anything, he stuffed the map into his pocket, unfolded, and hurried forward like a man who has just awakened from an awful dream that compressed into a single second all the detailed misery of some prolonged, oppressive nightmare. He broke into a steady trot that soon became a run. The perspiration poured from him. His legs felt weak and his breath was difficult to manage. He was only conscious of the overpowering desire to get away as fast as possible from the signpost at the crossroads where the dreadful vision had flashed upon him. For Martin, accountant on holiday, had never dreamed of any world of psychic possibilities. The entire thing was torture. It was worse than a cooked balance of the books that some conspiracy of clerks and directors proved at his innocent door. He ran as though the countryside ran crying at his heels. And always still ran with him the incredible conviction that none of this was really meant for himself at all. He had overheard the secrets of another. He had taken the warning for another into himself and so altered its direction. He had thereby prevented its right delivery. It all shocked him beyond words. The warning was intended for another who could not, would not, now receive it. The physical exertion, however, brought at length a more comfortable reaction and some measure of composure. With the lights in sight, he slowed down and entered the village at a reasonable pace. The inn was reached, a bedroom expected and engaged, and supper ordered with the solid comfort of a large Bass ale to satisfy an unholy thirst and complete the restoration of balance. The unusual sensations largely passed away, and the odd feeling that anything in his simple, wholesome world required explanation was no longer present. Still with a vague uneasiness about him, though actual fear quite gone, he went into the bar to smoke an after-supper pipe and chat with the natives, as his pleasure was upon a holiday, and so saw 2 men leading up the counter at the far end with their backs towards him. He saw their faces instantly in the glass, and the pipe nearly slipped from between his teeth. Clean-shaven, sleek, clever faces. And he caught a word or two as they talked over their drinks. German words. Well-dressed they were, both men, with nothing about them calling for particular attention. They might have been 2 tourists holiday-making like himself in tweeds and walking boots, and they presently paid for their drinks and went out. He never saw them face to face at all, but the sweat broke out afresh all over him. A feverish rush of heat and ice together ran about his body. Beyond question, he recognized the 2 tramps, this time not disguised, not yet disguised. He remained in his corner without moving, puffing violently at an extinguished pipe, gripped helplessly by the return of that first vile terror. It came again to him with an absolute clarity of certainty that it was not with himself they had to do, these men, and furthermore, he had no right in the world to interfere. He had no standing at all. It would be immoral, even if the opportunity came. And the opportunity he felt would come. He had been an eavesdropper and had come upon private information of a secret kind that he had no right to make use of, even if good might come, even to save life. He sat on in his corner, terrified and silent, waiting for the thing that should happen next. But night came without explanation. Nothing happened. He slept soundly. There was no other guest at the inn but an elderly man, apparently a tourist like himself. He wore gold-rimmed glasses, and in the morning Martin overheard him asking the landlord what direction he should take for Literacy Hill. His teeth began to chatter, and a weakness came into his knees. You turn to the left at the crossroads, Martin broke in before the landlord could reply. You will see the signpost about 2 miles from here, and after that it's a matter of 4 miles more. How in the world did he know? flashed horribly through him. I'm going that way myself, he was saying. I'll go with you for a bit if you don't mind. The words came out impulsively, ill-considered. Of their own accord, they came. For his own direction was exactly opposite. He did not want the man to go alone. The stranger, however, easily evaded his offer of companionship. He thanked him with the remark that he was starting later in the day. They were standing, all three, beside the horse trough in front of the inn, when at that very moment a tramp, slouching along the road, looked up and asked the time of day, and it was the man with the gold-rimmed glasses. Thank you, much obliged. Tramp replied, passing on with his slow, slouching gait, while the landlord, a talkative fellow, proceeded to remark upon the number of Germans that lived in England and were ready to swell the Teutonic invasion, which he, for his part, deemed imminent. But Martin heard it not. Before he had got a mile upon his way, he went into the woods to fight his conscience all alone. His feebleness, his cowardice was surely criminal. Real anguish tortured him. A dozen times he decided to go back upon his steps, and a dozen times the singular authority that whispered he had no right to interfere prevented him. How could he act upon knowledge gained by eavesdropping? How interfere in the private business of another's hidden life merely because he had overheard, as at the telephone, its secret dangers? Some inner confusion prevented straight thinking altogether. The stranger would merely think him mad. He had no fact to go upon. He smothered 100 impulses and finally went on his way with a shaking, troubled heart. The last 2 days of his holiday were ruined by doubts and questions and alarm, all justified later. When he read of the murder of a tourist on Littersea Hill, the man wore gold-rimmed glasses and carried in a belt about his person a large sum of money. His throat was cut, and the police were hard upon the trail of a mysterious pair of tramps said to be Germans. It's a good conservation synopsis candle.
Yes.
You're wasting that wax, you know. Pardon? I do. Appeals to the 18th century man in me. Never mind the Renaissance man. Well, I have to tell you that the most inquiries didn't come from all the noble literature that I read about it. It came from about Frederick Brown. Everybody wanted to. The last story seems to have captivated. Can't imagine why. Almost makes me want to read another one.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. The story is called The Face on the Wall by E.B. Lucas. I still tingle with mortification over an experience at Dabney's house last evening, the only satisfaction being that others tingle with me. We were talking of the supernatural, that unprofitable but endlessly alluring theme, and most of us have cited an instance without, however, producing much effect. Among the strangers to me was a little man with an anxious white face whom Rudson Waite had brought, and he watched each speaker with the closest attention but said nothing. Then Dabney, wishing to include him in the talk, turned to him and asked him if he had had any experience to relate a story that contained an inexplicable element. He thought a moment. Well, he said, not a story in the ordinary sense of the word, nothing that is from hearsay like most of your examples. Truth, I always hold, is not only vastly stranger than fiction, but also vastly more interesting. I could tell you an occurrence which happened to me personally and which oddly enough completed itself only this afternoon. We begged him to begin. A year or two ago, he said, I was in rooms in Great Ormond Street, an old house on the Holborn side. Bedroom walls had been distempered by a previous tenant, but the place was damp and great patches of discoloration had broken out. One of these, as indeed often happens, was exactly like a human face, but more faithfully and startlingly like than is customary. Lying in bed in the morning, putting off getting up, I used to watch it, and gradually I came to think of it as real, as my fellow lodger, in fact. The odd thing was that while the patches on the walls grew larger and changed their contours, this never did. It remained identically the same. While there, I had a very bad attack of influenza with complications, and all day long I had nothing to do but read or meditate. And it was then that this face began to get a firmer hold of me. It grew more and more real and remarkable. I may say that it dominated my thoughts day and night. There was a curious turn to the nose and a slant of the forehead that was unique. It was in fact full of individuality, the face of a man apart, a man in 1,000. Well, I got better, but the face still controlled me. I found myself searching the streets for one like it. Somewhere I was convinced the real man must exist, and him I must meet. Why? I had no notion. I only knew that he and I were in some way linked by fate. I frequented places where men congregate in large numbers, political meetings, football matches, the railway stations when the suburban trains pour forth their legions on the city in the morning and receive them again in the evening. But all in vain. I had never before realized, as I then did, how many different faces of man there are, and yet how few. For all differ, and yet classified, they belong only to as many groups as you can count on your hands. The search became a mania with me. I neglected everything else. I stood at busy corners watching the crowd until people thought me crazy, and the police began to know me and be suspicious. Women I never glanced at. Men, 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 all the time. Passed his hand wearily over his brow. And then, he continued, at last, I saw him. He was in a taxi driving east along Piccadilly. I turned and ran beside it for a little way, then saw an empty one coming. "Follow that taxi," I gasped, and leaped in. The driver managed to keep it in sight, and it took us to Charing Cross. I rushed onto the platform and found my man with 2 ladies and a little girl. They were going to France by the 2:20 train. I hung about to try and get a word with him, but in vain. Other friends had joined the party, and they moved to the train in a solid body. I hastily purchased a ticket to Folkestone, hoping that I should catch him on the boat before it sailed. But at Folkestone, he got on board before me with his friends, and they disappeared into a large private saloon, several cabins thrown into one. Evidently, he was a man of wealth. Again, I was foiled. But I determined to cross too, feeling certain that when the voyage had begun, he would leave the ladies and come out for a stroll on the deck. I had only just enough for the single fare to Boulogne, but nothing could shake me now. I took up my position opposite the saloon door and waited. After half an hour, the door opened and he came out, but with the little girl. My heart beat so that it seemed to shake the boat more than the propeller. There was no mistaking the face. Every line was the same. He glanced at me and moved towards the companionway for the upper deck. It was now or never, I felt. "Excuse me," I stammered, "but do you mind giving me your card? I have a very important reason for wishing to communicate with you." He seemed to be astonished, as indeed well he might. But he complied. With extreme deliberation, he took out his case and handed me his card and hurried on with the little girl. It was clear that he thought me a lunatic and considered it wiser to humour me than not. Clutching the card, I hurried to a deserted corner of the ship and read it. My eyes dimmed. My head swam, for on it were the words, "Mr. Ormond Wall." I don't believe that. With an address at Pittsburgh, USA. I remembered no more until I found myself in a hospital at Boulogne. There I lay in a broken condition for some weeks, and only a month ago did I return. He was silent. We looked at him and at one another and waited. All the other talk of the evening was nothing compared with the story of the little pale man. I went back, he resumed after a moment or so, to Great Ormond Street and set to work to discover all I could about this American in whose life I had in whose life I had so mysteriously intervened. I wrote to Pittsburgh, I wrote to American editors, I cultivated the Society of Americans in London, but all that I could find out was that he was a millionaire with English parents who had resided in London. But where? To that question, I received no answer. And so the time went on until yesterday morning. I had gone to bed more than usually tired and slept till late. When I woke, the sun was streaming into the room. As I always do, I looked at once at the wall on which the face is to be seen. I rubbed my eyes and sprang up in alarm. It was only faintly visible. Last night it had been as clear as ever. Almost I could hear it speak. And now it was but a ghost of itself. I got up dazed, dejected, went out. The early editions of the evening papers were already out, and on the contents bill I saw American Millionaire's Motor Accident. You must all have seen it. I bought it and read at once what I knew I should read. Mr. Ormond Wall, the Pittsburgh millionaire and party, motoring from Spezia to Pisa, had come into a collision with a wagon and were overturned. Mr. Wall's condition was critical. I went back to my room, still dazed, and sat on the bed, looking with unseeing eyes at the face on the wall. And even as I looked, suddenly, it completely disappeared. Later, I found out that Mr. Wall had succumbed to his injuries at what I take to be that very moment. Again, he was silent. Most remarkable, we said, most extraordinary, and so forth, and we meant it too. Yes, said the stranger. There are three extraordinary things, three most remarkable things about my story. One is that it should be possible for the discoloration in a lodging house in London not only to form the features of a gentleman in America, but to have this intimate association with his existence. It will take science some time to explain that. Another is that that gentleman's name should bear any relation to the spot on which his features were being so curiously reproduced by some mysterious agency. Is that not so? We agreed with him. And our original discussion on supernatural manifestation set in again with increased excitement, during which the narrator of the amazing experience rose and said good night. Just as he was at the door, one of the company, I rejoiced to think it was Spanton, recalled us to the cause of our excited debate by asking him before he left what he considered the third extraordinary thing in connection with his deeply interesting story. You said three things, you know, Spanton said. Oh, third thing, he said as he opened the door. I was forgetting that. The third extraordinary thing about the story is that I made it up about half an hour. After coming to our senses, we looked around for Rudson Waite, who had brought this snake to bite our bosoms, but he too had disappeared. Program began, I conversed over the iron railing out there with a young lady who pointed out that she was surprised to hear that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote all this other wonderful stuff. Forget Sherlock, you know. But all these marvelous stories, historical sagas, great things. Here is a book of, this is the book that I mentioned, wherever you may be, I got it from Barnes & Noble, but he enjoyed these stories and writing them far more than he ever enjoyed Sherlock, so it's sort of ironic that he would be immortalized for something that he could just dash off. I think the last 4 readings at least I've had at Conan Doyle. It's sort of nice to be, my friend Barbara says, a literary archaeologist and dig these things out. Read Conan Doyle's other stuff, it's good stuff. The Japanned Box. It was a curious thing, said the private tutor, one of those grotesque and whimsical incidents which occur to one as one goes through life. I lost the best situation which I'm ever likely to have through it. But I'm glad that I went to Thorpe Place, for I gained, well, as I tell you the story, you will learn what I gained. I don't know whether you're familiar with that part of the Midlands, which is drained by the River Avon. It is the most English part of England. Shakespeare, the flower of the whole race, was born right in the middle of it. It is a land of rolling pastures, rising in higher folds to the westward until they swell into the Malvern Hills. There are no towns, but numerous villages, each with its grey Norman church. You've left the brick of the southern and eastern counties behind you, and everything is stone. Stone for the walls and lichened slabs of stone for the roofs. It is all grim and solid and massive, as befits the heart of a great nation. It was in the middle of this country, not very far from Evesham, that Sir John Bollamore lived, in the old ancestral home of Thorpe Place, and thither it was that I came to teach his two little sons. Sir John was a widower. His wife had died 3 years before, and he had been left with these two lads, aged 8 and 10, and one dear little girl of 7. Miss Witherton, who is now my wife, was governess to this little girl. I was tutor to the two boys. Could there be a more obvious prelude to an engagement? She governs me now, and I tutor two little boys of our own, but there I have already revealed what it was which I gained at Thorpe Place. It was a very, very old house, incredibly old, pre-Norman some of it, and the Bollamores claimed to have lived in that situation since long before the Conquest, 1066. It struck a chill to my heart when first I came there, those enormously thick grey walls, the rude, crumbling stones, the smell as from a sick animal which exhaled from the rotting plaster of the aged building. But the modern wing was bright, and the garden was well kept. No house could be dismal which had a pretty girl inside it and such a show of roses in front. Apart from a very complete staff of servants, there were only 4 of us in the household. These were Miss Witherton, who was at that time 4 and 20, and as pretty as Mrs. Colmore is now. Myself, Frank Colmore, aged 30. Mrs. Stevens, the housekeeper, a dry, silent woman. And Mr. Richards, a tall, military-looking man who acted as steward to the Bollamore estates. We 4 always had our meals together, but Sir John had his usually alone in the library. Sometimes he joined us at dinner, but on the whole, we were just as glad when he did not. For he was a very formidable person. Imagine a man 6 foot 3 inches in height, majestically built, with a high-nosed, aristocratic face, brindled hair, shaggy eyebrows, and a small pointed Mephistophelian beard, and lines upon his brow and round his eyes as deep as if they had been carved with a penknife. He had grey eyes, weary, hopeless-looking eyes, proud and yet pathetic, eyes which claimed your pity and yet dared you to show it. His back was rounded with study, but otherwise he was as fine a looking man of his age, 5 and 50 perhaps, as any woman would wish to look upon. But his presence was not a cheerful one. It was always courteous, always refined, but singularly silent and retiring. I have never lived so long with any man and known so little of him. If he were indoors, he spent his time either in his own small study in the eastern tower or in the library in the modern wing. So regular was his routine that one could always say at any hour exactly where he would be. Twice in the day he would visit his study, once after breakfast and once about 10 at night. You might set your watch by the slam of the heavy door. For the rest of the day he would be in his library, save that for an hour or 2 in the afternoon he would take a walk or ride, which was solitary like the rest of his existence. He loved his children and was keenly interested in the progress of their studies, but they were a little awed by the silent, shaggy-browed figure, and they avoided him as much as they could. Indeed, we all did that. It was some time before I came to know anything about the circumstances of Sir John Bollamore's life, for Mrs. Stevens, the housekeeper, and Mr. Richards, the land steward, were too loyal to talk easily of their employer's affairs. As to the governess, she knew no more than I did, and our common interest was one of the causes which drew us together. At last, however, an incident occurred which led to a closer acquaintance with Mr. Richards and a fuller knowledge of the life of the man whom I served. The immediate cause of this was no less than the falling of Master Percy, the youngest of my pupils, into the mill race, with imminent danger both to his life and to mine, since I had to risk myself in order to save him. Dripping and exhausted, for I was far more spent than the child, I was making for my room when Sir John, who had heard the hubbub, opened the door of his little study and asked me what was the matter. I told him of the accident, but assured him that his child was in no danger, while he listened with a rugged, unmoving face which expressed in its intense eyes and tightened lips all the emotion which he tried to conceal. "One moment. Step in here. Let me have the details," said he, turning back through the open door. And so I found myself within that little sanctum, inside which, as I afterwards learned, no other foot had for 3 years been set, save that of the old servant who cleaned it out. It was a round room conforming to the shape of the tower in which it was situated, with a low ceiling, a single narrow ivy-wreathed window, and the simplest of furniture. An old carpet, a single chair, a deal table, and a small shelf of books made up the whole contents. On the table stood a full-length photograph of a woman. I took no particular notice of the features, but I remember that a certain gracious gentleness was the prevailing impression. Beside it were a large black japanned box and 1 or 2 bundles of letters or papers fastened together with elastic bands. Our interview was a short one, for Sir John Bollamore perceived that I was soaked and that I should change without delay. The incident led, however, to an instructive talk with Richards, the agent, who had never penetrated into the chamber which chance had opened to me. That very afternoon he came to me all curiosity and walked up and down the garden path with me while my 2 charges played tennis upon the lawn beside us. "You hardly realise the exception which has been made in your favour," said he. "That room has been kept such a mystery, and Sir John's visits to it have been so regular and consistent, that an almost superstitious feeling has arisen about it in the household. I assure you that if I were to repeat the tales which are flying about, tales of mysterious visitors there and of voices overheard by the servants, you might suspect that Sir John had relapsed into his old ways." "Why do you say relapsed?" I asked. He looked at me with surprise. "Is it possible," said he, "that Sir John Bollamore's previous history is unknown to you?" "Absolutely." "You astound me. I thought that every man in England knew something of his antecedents. I should not mention the matter if it were not that you are now one of ourselves, and the facts might come to your ears in some harsher form if I were silent upon them. I always took it for granted that you knew you were in the service of Devil Bollamore." "But why Devil?" I asked. "Oh, you are young, and the world moves fast, but 20 years ago the name of Devil Bollamore was one of the best known in London. He was the leader of the fastest set, bruiser, driver, gambler, drunkard, a survival of the old type, and as bad as the worst of them." I stared at him in amazement. "What?" I cried. "That quiet, studious, sad-faced man?" "The greatest rip and debauchee in England." All between ourselves, Colmore, but you understand now what I mean when I say that a woman's voice in his room might even now give rise to suspicion. What can have changed him so? Little Beryl Clare, when she took the risk of becoming his wife. That was the turning point. He had got so far that his own fast set had thrown him over. There is a world of difference, you know, between a man who drinks and a drunkard. They all drink, but they taboo a drunkard. He had become a slave to it, hopeless and helpless. Then she stepped in, saw the possibilities of a fine man in the wreck, took her chance in marrying him, though she might have had the pick of a dozen, and by devoting her life to it, brought him back to manhood and decency. You've observed that no liquor is ever kept in the house. There never has been any since her foot crossed its threshold. A drop of it would be like blood to a tiger, even now. Then her influence still holds him? That's the wonder of it. When she died 3 years ago, we all expected and feared that she would fall back into his old ways. She feared it herself, and the thought gave her terror to death. But she was like a guardian angel to that man and lived only for the one purpose. By the way, did you see a black Japan box in the room? Yes. I fancy it contains her letters. If ever he has occasion to be away, if only for a single night, he invariably takes his black Japan box with him. Well, Colmore, perhaps I've told you rather more than I should, but I shall be expecting you to reciprocate if anything of interest should come to your knowledge. I could see that the worthy man was consumed with curiosity, and just a little piqued that I, the newcomer, should have been the first to penetrate into the untrodden chamber. But the fact raised me in his esteem, and from that time onwards I found myself upon more confidential terms with him. And now the silent and majestic figure of my employer became an object of greater interest to me. I began to understand that strangely human look in his eyes, those deep lines upon his careworn face. He was a man who was fighting a ceaseless battle, holding at arm's length from morning till night, a horrible adversary who was forever trying to close with him, an adversary who would destroy him body and soul could it but fix its claws once more upon him. As I watched the grim round-backed figure pacing the corridor or walking in the garden, this imminent danger seemed to take bodily shape, and I could almost fancy I saw this most loathsome and dangerous of all the fiends crouching closely in his very shadow like a half-cowed beast, which slinks beside its keeper, ready at any unguarded moment to spring at his throat. And the dead woman, the woman who had spent her life in warding off this danger, took shape also to my imagination. And I saw her as a shadowy but beautiful presence, which intervened forever with arms uplifted to screen the man whom she loved. Some subtle way, he divined the sympathy which I had for him, and he showed in his own silent fashion that he appreciated it. He even invited me once to share his afternoon walk, and although no word passed between us on this occasion, it was a mark of confidence which he had never shown to anyone else. He asked me also to index his library. It was one of the best private libraries in England, and I spent many hours in the evening in his presence, if not in his society, he reading at his desk, and I sitting in a recess by the window, reducing to order the chaos which existed among his books. In spite of these close relations, I was never again asked to enter the chamber in the turret. And then came my revulsion of feeling. A single incident changed all my sympathy to loathing and made me realize that my employer still remained all that he had ever been, with the additional vice of hypocrisy. What happened was as follows. One evening, Miss Witherton had gone down to Broadway, the neighbouring village, to sing at a concert for some charity, and I, according to my promise, had walked over to escort her back. The drive sweeps round under the eastern turret, and I observed as I passed that the light was lit in the circular room. It was a summer evening, and the window, which was a little higher than our heads, was open. We were, as it happened, engrossed in our own conversation at the moment, and we had paused upon the lawn which skirts the old turret, when suddenly something broke in our talk and turned our thoughts away from our own affairs. It was a voice, the voice undoubtedly of a woman. It was low, so low that it was only in that still night air that we could have heard it, but hushed as it was, there was no mistaking its feminine tone. It spoke hurriedly, gaspingly for a few sentences, and then was silent, a piteous, breathless, imploring sort of voice. Miss Witherton and I stood for an instant staring at each other. Then we walked away in the direction of the hall door. It came through the window, I said. We must not play the part of eavesdroppers, she answered. We must forget that we've ever heard it. There was an absence of surprise in her manner which suggested a new idea to me. You've heard it before, I cried. I couldn't help it. My own room is higher up on the same turret. It has happened frequently. Who can the woman be? I have no idea. I'd rather not discuss it. Her voice was enough to show me what she thought. But granting that our employer led a double and dubious life, who could she be? This mysterious woman who kept him company in the old tower. I knew from my own inspection how bleak and bare a room it was. She certainly did not live there. But in that case, where did she come from? It could not be anyone of the household. They were all under the vigilant eyes of Mrs. Stevens. The visitor must come from without. But how? And then suddenly I remembered how ancient this building was, and how probably that some medieval passage existed in it. There's hardly an old castle without one. The mysterious room was the basement of the turret, so that if there were anything of the sort, it would open through the floor. There were numerous cottages in the immediate vicinity. The other end of the secret passage might lie among the tangle of brambles in the neighbouring coppice. I said nothing to anyone, but I felt that the secret of my employer lay within my power. All the more convinced I was of this, the more I marvelled at the manner in which he concealed his true nature. Often as I watched this austere figure, I asked myself if it were indeed possible that such a man could be living this double life. And I tried to persuade myself that my suspicions might after all prove ill-founded. There was the female voice, there was the secret nightly rendezvous in the turret chamber. How could such facts admit of an innocent interpretation? I conceived a horror of the man. I was filled with loathing at his deep, consistent hypocrisy. Only once during all those months did I ever see him without that sad but impassive mask which he usually presented towards his fellow man. For an instant I caught a glimpse of those volcanic fires which he had damped down so long. The occasion was an unworthy one, for the object of his wrath was none other than the aged charwoman, whom already I've mentioned as being the one person who was allowed within his mysterious chamber. I was passing the corridor which led to the turret, for my own room lay in that direction, when I heard a sudden, startled scream, and merged in it the husky growling note of a man who is inarticulate with passion. It was the snarl of a furious wild beast. Then I heard his voice thrilling with anger. "You would dare," he cried, "you would dare disobey my directions!" An instant later the charwoman passed me, flying down the passage, white-faced and tremulous, while a terrible voice thundered behind her, "Go to Mrs. Stevens for your money! Never set foot in Folk Place again!" Consumed with curiosity, I could not help following the woman, and found her round the corner, leaning against a wall and palpitating like a frightened rabbit. "What is the matter, Mrs. Brown?" I asked. "It's Master," she gasped. Oh, he frightened me. If you'd seen his eyes, Mr. Gilmore, sir, I thought he would have been the death of me." "What had you done?" "Done, sir, nothing. At least nothing to make so much of it. I just laid my hand on that black box of his. I hadn't even opened it when in he came, and you heard the way he went on. I've lost my place and I'm glad of it. But I wouldn't trust myself within reach of him again." So it was the Japan box which was the cause of this outburst. The box from which he would never permit himself to be separated. What was the connection, or was there any connection between this and the secret visits of the lady whose voice I had overheard? Sir John Bollamore's wrath was enduring as well as fiery, for from that day onwards Mrs. Brown the charwoman vanished from our ken, and Thorpe Place knew her no more. Now, I wish to tell you the singular chance which solved all these strange questions and put my employer's secret in my possession. The story may leave you with some lingering doubt as to whether my curiosity did not get the better of my honour, and whether I did not condescend to play the spy. If you choose to think so, I cannot help it, but can only assure you that, improbable as it may appear, the matter came about exactly as I describe it. The first stage in this denouement was that the small room in the turret became uninhabitable. This occurred through the fall of the worm-eaten oaken beam which supported the ceiling. Rotten with age, it snapped in the middle one morning, and brought down a quantity of plaster with it. Fortunately, Sir John was not in the room at the time. His precious box was rescued from amongst the debris and brought into the library, where henceforward it was to be locked within his bureau. Sir John took no steps to repair the damage, and I never had an opportunity of searching for that secret passage, the existence of which I had surmised. As to the lady, I had thought that this would have brought her visits to an end, had I not one evening heard Mr. Richard asking Mr. Stevens who the woman was whom he'd overheard talking to Sir John in the library. I could not catch her reply, but I saw from her manner that it was not the first time that she had had to answer or avoid the same question. "You've heard the voice, Calmore?" said the agent. I confessed that I had. "And what do you think of it?" I shrugged my shoulders and remarked that it was no business of mine. Come, you're just as curious as any of us. Is it a woman or not?" "It certainly is a woman." "Which room do you hear it from?" "From the turret room, before the ceiling fell." "But I heard it from the library only last night. I passed the doors as I was going to bed, and I heard something wailing and praying just as plainly as I hear you. It may be a woman." "Why, what else could it be?" He looked at me hard. "There are more things in heaven and earth," said he. "If it is a woman, how the hell does she get there?" "I don't know." "No, nor I. But if it is the other thing," but there, for a practical businessman at the end of the 19th century, this is rather a ridiculous line of conversation. He turned away, but I saw that he felt even more than he had said. To all the old ghost stories of Thorpe Place, a new one was being added before our very eyes. It may by this time have taken its permanent place, for though an explanation came to me, it never reached the others. And my explanation came in this way. I had suffered a sleepless night from neuralgia, and about midday had taken a heavy dose of chlorodyne to alleviate the pain. At that time I was finishing the indexing of Sir John Bollamore's library, and it was my custom to work there from 5 till 7. On this particular day I struggled against the double effect of my bad night and the narcotic. I've already mentioned that there was a recess in the library, and in this it was my habit to work. I settled down steadily to my task, but my weariness overcame me, and falling back upon the settee, I dropped into a heavy sleep. How long I slept, I don't know, but it was quite dark when I awoke. Confused by the chlorodyne which I had taken, I lay motionless in a semi-conscious state. The great room, with its high walls covered with books, loomed darkly all around me. A dim radiance from the moonlight came through the farther window, and against this lighter background I saw that Sir John Bollamore was sitting at his study table. His well-set head and clearly cut profile were sharply outlined against the glimmering square behind him. He bent as I watched him, and I heard the sharp turning of a key and the rasping of metal upon metal. As if in a dream, I was vaguely conscious that this was the japanned box which stood in front of him, and that he had drawn something out of it, something squat and uncouth, which now lay before him upon the table. I never realized, it never occurred to my bemuddled and torpid brain that I was intruding upon his privacy, that he imagined himself to be alone in the room. And then, just as it rushed upon my horrified perceptions, and I had half risen to announce my presence, I heard a strange, crisp, metallic clicking, and then the voice. Yes, it was a woman's voice. There could not be a doubt of it. But the voice was so charged with entreaty and with yearning love that it will ring forever in my ears. It came with a curious faraway tinkle, but every word was faint and clear, very faint, for they were the last words of a dying woman. "I'm not really gone, John," said the thin, gasping voice. "I'm here at your very elbow, and shall be here till we meet once more. I die happy to think that morning and night you will hear my voice. Oh, John, be strong, till we meet again." I say, that I had risen in order to announce my presence, but I could not do so while the voice was sounding. I could only remain half lying, half sitting, paralyzed, astounded, listening to those yearning, distant, musical words. And he was so absorbed that even if I had spoken, he might not have heard me. But with the silence of the voice came my half-articulated apologies and explanations. He sprang across the room, switched on the electric light, and in its white glare I saw him, his eyes gleaming with anger, his face twisted with passion, as the hapless charwoman may have seen him weeks before. "Mr. Cole, you here? What is the meaning of this?" With halting words I explained it all, my neuralgia, the narcotic, my luckless sleep and singular awakening. As he listened, the glow of anger faded from his face, and the sad, impassive mask closed once more over his features. "My secret is yours, Mr. Colmore. I have only myself to blame for relaxing my precautions. Half-confidences are worse than no confidences, and so you may know all, since you know so much. The story may go where you will when I have passed away, but until then I rely upon your sense of honor that no human soul shall hear it from your lips. I am proud still, God help me. For at least I am proud enough to resent that pity which this story would draw upon me. I have smiled at envy and disregarded hatred. But pity is more than I can tolerate. You have heard the source from which the voice comes. That voice which has, as I understand, excited so much curiosity in my household. I am aware of the rumors to which it has given rise. These speculations, whether scandalous or superstitious, are such as I can disregard and forgive. What I should never forgive would be a disloyal spying and eavesdropping in order to satisfy an illicit curiosity. But of that, Mr. Colmore, I acquit you. When I was a young man, sir, many years younger than you are now, I was launched upon town without friend or advisor, and with a purse which brought only too many false friends and false advisors to my side. I drank deeply of the wine of life. There is a man living who has drunk more deeply. He is not a man whom I envy. My purse suffered, my character suffered, my constitution suffered. Stimulants became a necessity to me. I was a creature from whom my memory recoils. And it was at that time, the time of my blackest degradation, that God sent into my life the gentlest, sweetest spirit that ever descended as a ministering angel from above. She loved me, broken as I was, loved me and spent her life in making a man once more of that which had degraded itself to the level of the beasts. But a fell disease struck her, and she withered away before my eyes. In the hour of her agony, it was never of herself, of her own sufferings and her own death that she thought. It was all of me. The one pang which her fate brought to her was the fear that when her influence was removed, I should revert to that which I had been. It was in vain that I made oath to her that no drop of wine would ever cross my lips. She knew only too well the hold that the devil had upon me, she who had striven so to loosen it. And it haunted her night and day, the thought that my soul might be again within his grip. It was from some friend's gossip of the sick room that she heard of this invention, this phonograph. And with the quick insight of a loving woman, she saw how she might use it for her ends. She sent me to London to procure the best which money could buy. With her dying breath, she gasped into it the words which have held me straight ever since. Lonely and broken, what else have I in all the world to uphold me? But it is enough. Please God, I shall face her without shame when he is pleased to reunite us. That is my secret, Mr. Colmore. And whilst I live, I leave it in your keeping. too sad a note to leave on. That was going to be it, but I've got to finish off with another Frederick Brown to send you. I nearly burst into tears with that one. Well, that's an interesting story. The Saint and the Beast all in one. Right? This is my favorite one, Expedition. A few of you remember this. I wonder if this would apply to Biosphereans. I was tempted to send a copy to the man in charge of this, who I once met at a seminar at Alcassandri, but I thought he'd think it was too cheeky. The first major expedition to Mars, said the history professor, the one which followed the preliminary exploration by one-man scout ships and aimed to establish a permanent colony, led to a great number of problems. One of the most perplexing of which was how many men and how many women should comprise the expedition's personnel of 30. There were 3 schools of thought on the subject. One was that the ship should be comprised of 15 men and 15 women, many of whom would no doubt find one another suitable mates and get the colony off to a fast start. The second was that the ship should take 25 men and 5 women, ones who were willing to sign a waiver on monogamous inclination, on the grounds that 5 women could easily keep 25 men sexually happy, and 25 men could keep 5 women even happier. The third school of thought, I know you're going to rush out and buy Frederick Brown. The third school of thought was that the expedition should contain 30 men, on the grounds that under those circumstances the men would be able to concentrate on the work at hand much better. And it was argued that since a second ship would follow in approximately a year and could contain mostly women, it would be no great hardship for the men to endure celibacy that long, especially since they were used to it. 2 space cadet schools, one for men and one for women, rigidly segregated the sexes. The director of space travel settled this argument by a simple expedient. Yes, Miss Ambrose? A girl in the class raised her hand. Professor, was that expedition the one headed by Captain Maxon, the one they called Mighty Maxon? Could you tell us how he came to have that nickname, please? I'm coming to that, Miss Ambrose. In lower schools, you've been told the story of the expedition, but not the entire story. You are now old enough to hear it. The director of space travel settled the argument, cut the Gordian knot, as it were, by announcing that the personnel of the expedition would be chosen by lot, regardless of sex, from the graduating classes of the 2 space academies. There's little doubt that he personally favoured 25 men to 5 women, because the men's school had approximately 500 in the graduating class, and the women's school had approximately 100. By the law of averages, the ratio of winners should have been 5 men to 1 woman. However, the law of averages does not always work out in any one particular series. And so it happened that on this particular drawing, 29 women drew winning chances. And only 1 man won.